anybody know this Lagash guy? Did anybody encounter him before?
This guy that is presented in the
first chapter that we read, yes.
The chapter 4, right?
Yeah.
This Le Riche guy.
Le Riche? No, Lagash.
Yeah, there's also a Lagash, I think, in the first chapter of the second part.
Oh, no. Oh, sorry. No. Yeah, Le Riche.
You meant Le Riche, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so what about this guy?
No, just it's the first time I encountered him. Maybe I wanted to if somebody could make like a brief introduction concerning this guy and how he relates to the to Bernard and Comte. That'd be interesting to me if anybody read anything about him or encountered him before. But that's I mean, if nobody had, then.
Does Goldstein mention him at any point?
I'm not sure, but when I was preparing the notes on the book, I found one paper on him and one paper by him that was translated into English. I haven't really read it, but the paper on him also emphasized this some of these ideas that Canguilhem brings forth, especially this one, where he says that health is a life lived in the silence of the organs, while disease is what irritates men in the normal course of their lives and work, and above all, what makes them suffer. So this idea about health being life lived in the silence of the organs, that this is something that he apparently is really very mostly known for. So yeah, but I don't really know his like overall position and his status. I would assume that for some reason he is quite important, otherwise Canguilhem wouldn't have dedicated a whole chapter to him. I'm guessing.
In general, there are so many of these names which I hear for the first time, and even in Goldstein, there's so many of these old physiologists and doctors and everything, and all of this seems to be forgotten today. Like when you're reading some I don't know, textbook on biology or something, it's mostly like, okay, Darwin, but other than that, it's usually just the modern contemporary authors, maybe like 30 years back, and everything else is basically passé.
That's true. But Claude, Bernard, and Comte, they are quite important. Like Comte is the founder of the positivism, and Bernard also like the starter of scientific study of physiology. But Le Riche, I'm not sure. The reason why I think he mentions him, or the reason why he brings him up, is because he seems to be proposing a position that is somehow in between or in the middle of what these other two guys were presenting, so Comte and Bernard, and what he's trying to develop. So he's trying to show that in Le Riche you already have some conceptions that move away from the classical notion that he's trying to criticize. That's what I get from this particular chapter. So that, for example,
No, go on.
that basically, for example, things like this idea that health is life lived in the silence of the organs and so on and so forth, that this is something he finds a move forward. So because you have to take into account this organismal view, and that the organism and the living being kind of determines or gives a positive context content to the notion of health and disease, but then he reverts back to the idea that still you have to take into account aspects that are not accessible to human experience and consciousness, and that disease has to be dehumanized. So it has to be boiled down to certain physiological processes that are more or less mechanist in nature. And this is where he provides this example of a latent disease, or a disease that is not present, where somebody has a cancer but doesn't know that he or she has a cancer. And so the person is sick, the person is diseased, but it is not sick in the sense that it would be aware of its being sick or diseased. Hello, Ola. So Ola, just to let you in, apparently today we're not having the initial presentation. We just immediately rushed into the discussion of sorts.
One question I would have in regards to Le Riche and I guess Canguilhem, insofar as he basically continues a part of Le Riche, is whether we could call this view like this view of disease as subjective, because it takes into account how the sick person himself, like you have this objective view where it's the physiologist studying an organism and trying to determine where the disease is located and everything. And on the other hand, which I suppose Le Riche somehow opens up, is this more subjective perspective. Could we talk about some kind of subjectivism here? Because I don't think he ever, Canguilhem ever uses that word, or doesn't use it very much.
I don't think that you could speak about subjectivism in the usual or the prototypical sense of the term, in the sense of I think that what Canguilhem is trying to do is trying to develop like this domain of life or living, or what he sometimes calls also experience in a certain sense, or behavior, which is neither strictly subjective nor objective. Subjective would mean something that doesn't really have any value whatsoever. So for example, in the classical distinction, you have a reality that is objective, and this is what pertains to truth. And then you have subjective realm, which is somehow secondary or derivative, and it doesn't really have much to do with things as they are, with the domain of truth or domain of phenomena that are pertinent. But Canguilhem tries to point out that this is the wrong way of looking at things. So there is a domain of life, of vitality, which is the domain of behavior, and you have to take it into account because it's somehow more primordial, more primary than either objectivism or subjectivism. So for example, a biologist who tries to study living beings cannot really get out of this realm, because if you want to understand what's happening, you have to take into account the meaning that is happening on the level of on the vital level. I think that the example with pain is most interesting here, but he tries to show that pain is not simply an epiphenomenon and that it cannot be simply discarded, that it doesn't, of course, have the same value or the same structure or nature as, let's say, scientific analysis, but it still has a specific, how does he call it, something like vital significance or vital meaning. But I've talked for too long. Maybe somebody else would like to chime in.
Oh, yeah, if I understand him correctly, he's not making the point that pain as something subjective is the true reality, and that the objective anatomical fact is less relevant, but rather that I think he says somewhere, I'm not sure if Canguilhem says that or Lariche, but the point is that the anatomist's or the physician's experience, the physician's knowledge of the sick man is also based on his experience of sick people. So I think he's making something similar to the Husserlian point about the origin of scientific knowledge, if I understood that correctly.
But could we then not take a more lenient view of subjectivity, rather than just saying that it's secondary and not important, but just to take subjectivity as something which originates which has the perspective in the subject itself, looking at itself, trying to objectify itself to itself, rather than trying to look at something out there, like a physiologist does, but just subjective in the sense it's me looking at myself, which is basically looking at my experience.
But there's a problem with that. The problem is that he would claim that the realm of vitality is also present already at the level of beings that are not necessarily self-conscious in the human type of way. But that, so here's the problem. The main problem is as follows. He would like to carve out a middle ground between two extremes, where you have the idea of, let's say, a strictly mechanical understanding of physiology and anatomy, and something that would be relegated to some sort of consciousness. You have a realm or domain of living, which in a certain sense is already a domain of meaning and significance, and it is something that is present both in human beings and in other living beings. And you have to understand this as a domain that has its own dynamics and is somehow autonomous, at least in the sense of that you're not able basically to translate biological phenomena into, say, mechanical or physical phenomena, but that they are somehow authentic phenomena in their own right. And it is basically something that is given to you both in how you see things when you look at something, and also how you experience these things. So you as a living being somehow study specific diseases, and the whole endeavor makes sense to you because you yourself as a living being, understand what sickness is, what illness is. So he doesn't really, by the way, he will never go into these circles and try to understand them, but this is something that he's constantly trying to kind of bring forth. What maybe I would add here is this, what I was saying about pain. So the point that Lariche makes is that pain is somehow, it's not to be trusted, because you have people that have pains, but then it turns out that their pain has nothing whatsoever to do with the organic happening, with the anatomical issues or physiological issues. So, and this is, as he says, every physician kind of has had this embarrassing experience where they were taking the accounts about pains too literally, and then ended up seeing that they were on a completely wrong track, and they were, basically sidetracked. But Canguilhem's point is that, yes, sure, pain, this is how he puts it. This is on page 98. it can be admitted that pain is a vital sensation. This is, I think, important. It's a vital sensation without admitting that it has a particular organ or that it has an encyclopedic value as a mine of information with regard to the topographical or functional order. So what does he mean by this? Encyclopedic value means that it basically, pain will not give you the same account of what's happening as an analysis would give you. So if you take your critical faculties and study a disease, you will get a different picture than something that will be given by pain. But pain is something that has a specific meaning. It alerts you that something is wrong, and sometimes it even points you to the right direction. So even though, you know, the study, eventual theoretical study, investigation, reflection will provide models of what's happening, and this might then enable you to deal with diseases more efficiently. Pain is what has stimulated this. So it is the pain, and for this reason, pain has a specific vital information. It has a specific significance. It is a vital sensation in the sense of it's not just an epiphenomenon, but it is something that directs and motivates your epistemic endeavors. So your knowledge is somehow kind of at the service, in the certain sense, of your vitality, so to speak.
I think Canguilhem writes at some point that, yeah, sure, whoever started talking.
No, I was just thinking about this pain thing. I have a feeling it's connected. I have a feeling because it's connected with our whole, you know, sense data. How to call it? Our capability to feel. Because there are some diseases when you, for example, can't feel your feet, and those people really struggle with keeping their feet healthy because they don't know when they hit something, and they don't know that something is too tight, if the shoe is too tight, for example, and they have really bad problems because of that. And I think I kind of like this chapter, I mean this part about pain, because it's really like an alert mechanism for whole body to stay in touch what you're doing with yourself and how are you interacting with the environment.
Yeah, and in this sense, what Eneas just pointed out is something that is that pain has a specific significance and meaning, and it's not just an epiphenomenon in the narrow sense. I think that I really like this. So he says that pain is neither an expression of a normal activity of a sense susceptible to permanent stimuli. It is not a detector of signal for events menacing organic integrity. So these are all physiological accounts, yeah? It is not a reaction of salutary defense. Instead, it is, and this is Le Riche's notion, a monstrous individual phenomenon. A monstrous individual phenomenon, because it carries a specific significance for the organism in question. And it basically, for you to be able to understand it, you have to take it into account. So the pain in its specificity as it is related to the individual organism. Okay, I would like to direct this to one question, and I would be really glad if you could kind of do a little bit of brainstorming on that. It's closely related to what we've been talking about. And now I can't find the document. But it is related to this. If you go to the page 100 and 101. So 100, 101. He talks about something that I find simply fascinating. This is something I really, really like. This is the reason why I've gotten into Canguilhem. So I'm going to read this quote, and then please share your thoughts on it. I'm not going to read it in full. Disease reveals normal functions to us at the precise moment when it deprives us of their exercise. Disease is the source of the speculative attention which life attaches to life by means of man. If health is life in the silence of the organs, then strictly speaking, there is no science of health. Health is organic innocence. It must be lost, like all innocence, so that knowledge may be possible. Physiology is like all science, which, as Aristotle says, proceeds from wonder. But the truly vital wonder is the anguish caused by disease. I find this just interesting on so many levels. So you basically have disease or anguish, pain, are vital wonder. It is what instigates epistemic endeavors. So normally this is something that you kind of take for granted, or you just skip and you start already from the knowledge. But basically, usually it goes like this. So you do a little bit of pathology, and then pathology tells you about, you kind of try to restructure pathology from physiology. But what Canguilhem is trying to point out, that in order for you to get to the physiology, in order for you to get to the healthy state, you basically have to go through the period of anguish or potential anguish, because this is something that kind of discloses these realms of normal functioning. He says on page 99, knowledge of the physiological state is obtained by retrospective abstraction from the clinical and therapeutic experience. So there is life, and life is interested in healing and preservation. So it develops specific techniques which translate into clinical and therapeutic experience. And then, as part of this, what you do is you construct theories and models about the normal state of events. And this functions for a while, and then new diseases pop up and new problems emerge. And then this corrects your understanding, your models. So basically, this eruption of disease and pain is kind of crucial in the epistemic process. Okay, so that's the idea I find fascinating. Any thoughts on that?
You could also say that normality as such isn't available to you unless you have some sort of a disruption, in the sense that the disruption itself is a sign of a norm. The norm cannot be present without a disruption. It's like a tension. At least that's how I understand him. Like, you cannot have an experience of a norm otherwise than in a sort of a tension between itself and a deviation from it or something. Like, this is a kind of alternative to a norm as a kind of statistical average, I think. And these two notions are something that I find interesting. I mean, the relation between them, I haven't quite fully grasped, but yeah, that's something to think about also, I think.
This is something that he will cover in the next section, which I will be presenting. So the statistical and normative and polarity, but that's definitely true. Yeah. So, but just this idea that, disease and pain is the source of the speculative attention, and that it is it is the source of vital wonder. It's just, I find this.
Why should this conclusion be necessary? Like, I can see that experiencing disease may be one of the reasons why that leads you to actually studying physiology, to having a theory, But why couldn't you just be curious? Because, I don't know, like as a human, you suddenly have this, I don't know, you experience the shift where you start seeing objects and you're subjects, and you see a lot of things before yourself, and you're just curious about them because they're out there. Why should you have to be sick first?
I'm very sympathetic to this question, and also want to add, like, I find it curious why there's no mention of pleasure in this in these theories. Like, why is there only talk of negative values and not of like a positive deviation from a norm? Like, is that impossible in his view, or I don't know, just like a side
I would basically defend Canguilhem here strongly. And the thing is, Primoz, the reason why I think that Canguilhem is onto something is because you have what you've presented is like you have this snapshot view of a human being that is there with this self-reflective capacity and then has the ability to be curious. Okay, true, maybe interesting, but you're forgetting about the history that the whole living species have been through, which have culminated in this, and the way that basically the organisms were developing and the fragments of cognition were developing was something that has been forged during times where there was no curiosity and self-reflective activity. So in a certain sense, even if you say at a certain point there's curiosity, but one might say, cool, but even a curiosity has a certain genealogical history. So there is a certain story that could be said about curiosity, and that curiosity is not simply, I'm here and I'm curious, but why are you curious? What is the drive behind being curious? What has made you as a living being a curious and interested being? Just so? I don't buy it. I mean, you can say this, you can say this to a certain degree, but I would say that there is a specific story that even curiosity has somehow developed in relation to this. And with regards to the pleasurable states do not bring about the eruption in the same way. They are more like confirmation of something. Of course, they can eventually turn into something that is bad for you, like taking too much drugs or something like that, or whatever. Yeah. So any type of excessive pleasure can eventually lead to something that is detrimental. But they do really they kind of keep you in the, I would say, pleasure does not really throw you out of your equilibrium in the same way that, let's say, pain or disease does. I don't have the feeling that it's necessarily, it is not necessarily, you do not kind of attain this, how should I put it, like a distance of sorts. Something has gone awry, something has fallen apart, and now you kind of have to reestablish a certain equilibrium. You're just kind of getting feedback that the situation and the equilibrium you're in is basically good.
I see, but I think that's symptomatic of a kind of a equilibrium type theory of health that isn't at all like obvious, at least to me. It seems that Canguilhem sort of goes in this direction, but yeah, I mean, I find it curious because, of course, you have experiences of pleasure, and I think at least like what's his name, Vörös's account kind of ignores this polarity of experience as opposed to pain of like a in healthy or pathological states. At least that's how I saw it, but of course I'm not really familiar with him. It might be possible that just, of course, he talks about, I mean, of course, probably just Canguilhem fails to mention this part of his theory, I guess. But still, I'm not entirely like satisfied with your take on this.
Yeah. I think that he actually does mention this. I'm going to try to find something along these lines, but I forgot. Not sure, really.
Mentions the word pleasure twice.
Yeah, I saw that too. And it doesn't really fit the bill of what he's trying to of what Timothée was bringing up.
mean, the way I understood it would be probably best illustrated by a related and more general epistemological point. Namely that the only reason that we have something like a notion of physical space, and by extension atoms, molecules, and living beings, is that we are embodied beings that can bump into things. You know, if it weren't for that, if we didn't have a reason to get somewhere and, you know, that affective drive to do something, and if we didn't bump into other things preventing us from doing that, we couldn't possibly have any kind of a notion of physical space. Would that be sort of related to what Canguilhem is trying to say about pain?
I feel like it's sort of part of the general discussions we've been having also about technique. Like when we're talking about the development of fingers, of opposable fingers being kind of the precursor to cognition and to the development of cognition of the neocortex and so forth. I think it's like it's a large theme we've been circling around and through.
Maybe before we get into that, I found an interesting quote on page 208 and 209. This is where Canguilhem basically gets back to this point that we were discussing now. And he says the following. Again, the way he phrases things is just fabulous. I mean, really, this is hardcore stuff. This is what he says. I'm just going to read some fragments. Summarizing the hypothesis we proposed in the course of examining Leriche's ideas, we can say that in biology, it is the pathos which conditions the logos, because it gives it its name. So pathos conditions the logos. It is the abnormal which arouses theoretical interest in the normal. And now this is the interesting part. He mentions some guy, A. Schwartz, following Ernst Naville, points out the glaring disproportion, this is interesting, the glaring disproportion between the place occupied by sleep in men's lives and the place accorded it in works of physiology. Just as Georges Dumas points out that the bibliography on pleasure is minute, so very small, compared to the plethora of works devoted to pain. This is because the essence of sleep and enjoyment is to let life go without calling it into account. This is the point I was trying to make. So sleep and enjoyment, they let life go without calling it into account. So they don't really call it into account. When you're experiencing pleasure, there is no need for you to basically take on a theoretical attitude towards life. You are submerged, absorbed, embedded in life, I would say. You are in the flow in a certain sense. But with pain, what happens is there is a rupture, there is a disruption. And what happens is that you take on the attitude where, as he calls it, you call life into account.
But is this true? Like, could not pleasure also evoke like a norm-breaking experience, which eventually propels you towards theoretical thinking? Like,
well, let's use two concrete examples. When you're having sex or you're just about to orgasm, are you in the position of rupture where you kind of and you try to reflect and construct a model? Or, for example, when you're really high, I mean, you can talk about certain things, but you don't really, I mean, maybe here could be an interesting, case in point, but if you're feeling good about things, normally you flow with the experience. If you're having a bad trip, that's a different story. Now, a bad trip, this will call life into account for sure.
I don't think this applies. I mean, you could say also for extreme pain that, of course, you're not able to think clearly when you're in extreme pain, just as in extreme pleasure. But I don't think this is a good example at all. I mean, at least for me, I find myself thinking best when I'm sort of low-level happy. I mean, but I don't think this is a good argument either. It's just like, what I wanted to say before is like, if you account for, I mean, you said when you're in flow, like, isn't flow also a kind of a concept that pertains to learning? I'm not really sure. I mean, I think Primož mentioned that you speaking about flow states in like a discussion group or something. So maybe you could say something on that.
I mean, for example, if we take, I don't know, a sunset, and you're looking at a sunset, and it just this sublime experience sort of brings you into a very particular relationship with nature. And I think this might inspire you towards theoretical thinking as much as some kind of negative experience. And I think our artistic work, for example, as well as philosophical work, can originate from these basically pleasant experiences. So I think it goes in both directions. Whatever sort of takes you out or forces you to kind of reevaluate things, to establish a new norm, it can potentially lead towards theoretical reflection and physiology.
One interesting difference when it pertains to pain and the body, experiencing the body, is that the difference is that in pleasant experience, the body, even though it is mediating the experience, is sort of transparent. And in negative experience, in pain, it's not transparent in the same way. I mean, okay, cases of extreme pain would be an interesting example, but normally when you're experiencing pain, your body is not it's not a transparent vector for something, but you're focused on the part of your body that's experiencing pain. Whereas in pleasure, you're not, you're just focused at the experience that you're having.
Anand, that's a really good point. And I think I already mentioned this book one. It's by Leder. The book is called The Absent Body. And it's basically a phenomenological study, for the most part, about how your experience of body is such that when your body is functioning normally, when you're healthy, your body is basically transparent, so to speak. And Leder uses the notion of disappearing body. So it's disappearing, it's not appearing. But there's a twist to the terminological story here, because he says that when illness or pain kicks in, what happens is that your body becomes present. So what has been absent, what has been something that was completely transparent, becomes present all of a sudden. And he speaks, instead of disappearing with an I, about disappearing with a Y. So, disappearing, I'm going to write this down. So like this appearing and this appearing, as in something that has gone awry. And it's a really nice terminological distinction. And the thing is that the book is just a marvelous read. I strongly recommend you to pick it up and read it, because it reads extremely well. And he provides many, many examples, and I've forgotten almost all of them. And then even draws interesting philosophical conclusions from this. So yeah, it's a fascinating study, and this is a really good point, Adnan. I would agree with that. So in pleasure, I would say that you still are somehow embedded in the world, in the sense of your body being a transparent vehicle of your embeddedness, whereas in disease, your body itself somehow starts appearing, and it appears in a way that shatters or breaks the usual temporal experience that you've had.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting Heideggerian point here. Just like a tool, just like an object that you're using for some purpose, only becomes given to you as an object, as an objective object, what he calls Vorhandensein, which is, not, okay, I really have no clue how that term is translated, but not to hand, not ready to hand. I think that's the expression. Just like that, the body only becomes an objective body, the only sort of body that you can have a science about, or rather based on, when it's malfunctioning.
This is precisely what Leder then makes. This is one of the points that he makes in the second part of the book, where he says that Descartes' body is basically a diseased body. So that basically what was taken as a foundation there, like of a sort of the overall project, was in a certain sense a diseased body, a body that has been an appearing body. It's the point is not made as simple as I'm now presenting it here by no means, but it's an interesting, you know, spin on things.
But why would that be good? I mean, why would you spend time thinking about your body when it's in pain or whatever? If you when you're in normal state, you don't have to, you know, waste it. I mean, what is the benefit of knowing, I don't know, feeling your leg when you can spend all day not thinking about your leg? Because I don't think this is a good point. I mean, of course, when you're sick, yes, I have to fix the leg. I don't know, someone cut it. But otherwise, why?
Yeah, I guess that because if you understand it, then you can fix it, and you can fix it every single time some trouble arises. So that I think would also be a distinction between like a pleasurable experience and a disease or pain or some limitation to the body, because when you a pleasurable experience is maybe not so epistemically interesting, because it doesn't provide like a problem of how to fix it, how to get back to the normal states, while the damaging experience, the pain, poses a problem which demands like a very concrete solution to returning to not painful states.
Yes, but I also have a problem with that, because then it reduces curiosity to a mere problem solving. And I don't like that, because we have heuristics for problem solving, but I think there's a bit more human than just heuristics, but that's just me.
I mean, maybe
I agree. I don't know.
Maybe one way to phrase it would be that without taking the dignity away from curiosity, while accepting that it's a sort of problem solving, would be to say that, yeah, maybe it is problem solving, but it's not solving merely some kind of practical problem, how to get from A to B or how to get rid of a pain in your leg, but it's solving, you know, the problem of being, something far more overarching than that.
This is something that I was thinking about. And yeah, let me give you a concrete example about this. I think you're right. So there are different probably layers to this question. And one layer would be, you know, my leg hurts. So what can, you know, can I understand it in a way that it will not hurt me in the future should something similar happen? Or maybe I could even prevent this. But then you can have something that goes way deeper. And I'll use a very, very famous story, and I haven't used it in quite some time. And that's the story of the Buddha. So there are these famous four signs, you probably know this, in the Buddha story, where the prince goes out and first he sees the diseased person, and then he sees the sick person, and then he sees the dead person, and then he sees an ascetic, okay? And the thing is, so you can ask about how can I fix a broken leg so that it doesn't break again, or if it breaks, I can mend it. But this also opens up the question of, say, the suffering as such. Suffering, transitoriness, the necessity of dying. And then this opens the questions, what can I do about this in general? What does it all mean in a certain sense? So it's not, I would say, something that is relegated strictly to being a pragmatic problem solver or to someone who tries to solve technical issues. But this opens up a whole spectrum of layered circles about this. And this can go very deep to something what Adnan said, like the question about being in a certain sense. Yeah. So you can ask about what went wrong that my leg was broken. And then you can ask questions like, was what happened there more real than my experience? You know, why didn't I feel pain when I saw that something was wrong? I don't know. I'm just making things up as I go now. But you know what I mean? So there are like a multiplicity of circles where you can get very deep. And you can end up with questions such as, life is apparently permeated with suffering and transitoriness. What can I do about it? Not in the sense of I want to fix things, but I want to live in a way that will take this into account, and it will make for a meaningful living, a way of life that will not kind of allow all these dimensions, essential dimensions of life, to hurt me.
But why should all this center around disease? Like, can't a pleasurable experience evoke similar thinking? Like we said before, that pleasure doesn't evoke like some kind of a problem, what is to be fixed, but in a way it does. The problem is how to repeat the pleasurable experience, and this can actually lead you towards thinking also about the transitoriness of pleasure and everything.
Yeah, but the thing is, you're not going to think about how to repeat the pleasurable experience until you have a longing to do so, until you have a desire to do so. And the moment you have a desire to do so, you're already experiencing something negative, or an
There's
absence
suffering
of
in between, Primož. There's suffering in between.
But why should disease get the primacy in this equation? Why isn't it equal? Like, you need both.
I mean, I suppose you could say that you need both if you have some kind of a vital, norm or an organism, whatever. But I think the point is that disease can kind of open that up more directly, because with pleasure, you first need pleasure to appear and then to disappear, or to get less intense, for you to have that kind of a problem-solving approach. Whereas with disease, it's immediate in a sense.
I think the presupposition here, like of this primacy of disease, is that the vital norm is somehow related to staying alive. Like, the primary objective of an organism is to stay alive, is to not die, right? So, I guess that's kind of convincing, at least to me. I mean, I would like to find an alternative, because I think that you should like have a way to account, even in this like very like first order basic level of vital normativity, a kind of surpassing or a surplus, or something like some sort of directed activity that's not just finding means of survival, like finding like that responding to dangers to survival. Like, I mean, you could go here very like very deeply into like this this reproductive theory of life and not metabolic, like what's the word I'm looking for?
Self-maintenance?
Self-maintenance, yes. So you have like the theory of life proposed by, I guess, Varela. It's I mean, it's basically like autopoietic theory that the primary like I mean, like you could define life by it being like a system that produces its own parts, right? Its own structuring. And then the other thing that's very important is that it can reproduce, like it can copy itself. And this is like something that's not accounted for, like I think with theories that guide that see vital normativity entirely as something enabling an organism to respond to danger for itself, for its individual self. So this is something I think I would like to get clear more on.
Any thoughts on that? So if I understood you correctly, Timotei, you have issues that it's only related to self-preservation, that there's like a moment that goes beyond that?
Yeah, I mean, like you could see like
development, growth, and
yeah. I think like also in Varela or like the other day I was reading an article that was by Di Paolo that mentions Ashby's. He calls it ultra stable system, and I think it's a very nice like a simple model of what this kind of system would be, and it kind of relates to what we were saying earlier. So you have like this. These basic states that the system tries to maintain itself in, like And then you have like, when the system deviates from these states, it changes up its sensomotoric coupling to the environment. So it has like a few rules, like if this, then that, if this perception, then this action. And these rules are modified when the organism strays out of its basic parameters, right? So this could be like what you were saying, Sebastjan, like pain is an indicator that you have to think, right? But this is all like based on the premise that the entire system, all it's trying to achieve is achieve a kind of equilibrium, or at least a kind of stable state of itself, right? So
okay, I like that. I think that yeah, I think that, and I get what you're saying. My response would maybe be that pain is basically a challenge which allows you to modify or adopt to the situation in a way that somehow provides for a means of being that is structured on a slightly higher level. So you can either, by developing a certain technique, you can already live in a way where you have a certain insight into something that previously was completely out of reach. And by doing so, you can already live in a different reality, in a different realm. Why? Because you live in a realm of techniques which allow you to deal with illnesses. So already this is a different mode of being. But then you can go further than this, where you can slowly get to the question of, okay, I'm solving each individual problem separately. Then you can start lumping them together into similar clusters of problems. And eventually you can get to the level where you start thinking about problems as such. And this, I think, is a certain development which is, even if it starts from the premise of self-preservation, every step you make in that direction transforms your mode of being. So your mode of being that you're trying to preserve is actually different. So every interaction translates into a transformation, which opens up new possibilities, but also new problems, and eventually also new. So the way I see it is that there are specific jumps that you achieve by doing this.
I think there could be an interesting parallel drawn here with artistic practice. So for some time, I was convinced that the kind of the optimal absorption in playing music, for example, would be to be completely immersed in what you're doing. So to really kind of lose all the explicit understanding of one body, to completely kind of contain the implicitness of every gesture. But what I realized actually by reading Merleau-Ponty is that an interesting problem arises here. So if you take this kind of pleasurable moment of complete absorption, what happens is that, for example, you want to play something really, really nervous or really tense, right? You want to recreate that experience. But the problem is that if you want that to recreate that directly, you yourself become tense or anxious. But that itself can destroy the very possibility of creating the meaning, the expression. So basically, the way I think about absorption now is actually quite similar to how one could interpret the flow. So basically, that if you're just focused on pleasurable experiences, you kind of always stray from the path. Like, you cannot keep yourself going in the right direction. But if you experience the painful, the objective, the explicit failures of this pleasure, and then incorporate them into your dealing with kind of the stability of pleasure, then you can be in the pleasurable mode more often. And this, for me, is kind of this, there's what I found a little bit dubious was that the pain we're talking about is understood very a little too transparent I think. So we're actually constantly in pain, right? Every day you have a person has experiences a lot of pain. The problem is, of course, to differentiate between the important and not important, but that is not done. I mean, you need certain kinds of techniques of differentiating between these, so you can stay in the pleasurable, healthy mode of life. So I think they're more intertwined than we kind of we admitted so far.
Maybe Nietzsche's conception of pleasure is relevant here. He says that it's a pain in low dosages, or a pain you can handle. So this could be like kind of, you could say, like, when you're able to learn and overcome it, then it's pleasure. But when it really gets out of hand, then you experience it as pain. This could be a kind of line of thought, but I mean, it's a very speculative one.
Isaac, but I really like what you've said with, so this being completely submerged. Were you referring, this is a side note maybe, but were you referring to the part in Phenomenology of Perception when he talks about the psychiatrist who tries to understand the experience of a schizophrenic?
No, actually, to structure of behavior, the symbolic part.
But this is similar, because he says that basically, you know, the psychiatrist has traditionally he has two options. So either he takes on a completely withdrawn, removed position, and he just observes the schizophrenic from the outside, almost semi-automaton-like, or he says he can shoot himself with the injection of adrenaline and basically have the psychotic episode his own. But if this happens, he's psychotic as well. So he cannot really understand what's happening because he's kind of undergoing it. And his point is that there is the possibility, if you take on Merleau-Ponty's approach, where you kind of enter into the realm of significance of what the psychotic person is experiencing without necessarily living through what the other person is living through. So you can understand the experience of the other with the appropriate approach. But so it's a bit different from what you said, but the part where, you know, the psychiatrist can shoot himself with the adrenaline, I don't know why he uses that particular drug, and undergo the psychotic experience or episode himself or herself, reminded me of what you said. You want to play in a nervous way, and because you want to play in a nervous way, you become nervous, and then you cannot really play in a nervous way.
This is kind of related to the different approaches actors take. Like, you have the whole method acting approach, where the people really try to get into the state of the people they're trying to portray, and then they're kind of acting the same way while on the set, not even filming or anything. And but on the other hand, you have the approach where they just some kind of intellectual, empathic understanding of a certain behavior of a certain person. They basically mechanically reconstruct that state without having to really go into that person and go through all the through emotional train wreck of the characters they're trying to portray. So it's the same tension, I think, but both approaches are possible in art.
I would maybe like to raise a different topic now, one that is, I'm assuming, very close to Enea's interests, namely the question of technique and technology. This is something that kind of is constantly popping up, and it will continue to pop up. So basically, this is the idea that Canguilhem tries to kind of move away from the classical understanding of the relationship between science/theory and technology or technique, where you have science that then needs to be translated into technology or technique. So you have to know in order to act, as he puts it. So, and technology is what allows you to act. But he kind of puts forward this different understanding conception of technology, which is, in a certain sense, autonomous or semi-autonomous with regards to theory and science. And it is more strongly related to the organic and vital. So organic as such is, in a certain sense, strongly related to techniques, and in this regard also to technological. And it is usually the case that technology, which is not really a well-structured set of propositions and a well-structured system of knowing about the world, but it is more of a kind of tinker-toying and experimenting and trying things out, eventually gets translated into theoretical models. So there is a moment of what he calls, he says, this is what is true of empiricism. So empirical philosophy was true in one sense, namely, it is a philosophy of intellectual adventure. Philosophy of intellectual adventure. And it is this understanding of technology that needs to be taken on board, where technology is something that calls forth theoretical reflection, but is not subsumed to that theoretical reflection. So it is not theoretical reflection that predetermines technology. Technology is not strictly only application. It is through actively doing things, meddling with things, developing techniques, that you eventually end up with certain theories that try to explain what the heck it is you're doing. And I will give a concrete example, the one I've already used. And Adnan will agree with me on this. Again, people in blockchain. This is a very, very fast-paced environment. Projects develop all the time, and they develop very quickly. And people don't really know what the heck they're doing often. They have a vague idea, and they start doing something, and they tinker with something, and then they get a certain result, and they don't really know what the implications are, and they don't even have a clear grasp of what they've produced and how it functions sometimes. They have an approximate understanding. But then once this product is out there, it is kind of taken over by other people, and they start meddling with it, and they start developing it, and then they go in very different directions. So there's always this lag in theory with regards to technology. I have a phone call, I apologize, so go on without me.
Is there really always such a lag? Or can we think of some kind of case where the theory was actually way ahead of the technology?
Theory of relativity? No?
Yeah, I suppose. I don't really know it.
It was formulated before it was tested, or even, I mean, nowadays string theory perhaps, developing really at the forefront, not even being, like, in the near future, being able to be tested.
But I don't think he meant just the technology of measuring or testing stuff. I mean, his point would be maybe, I mean, even tinkering with mathematical models, I think pertains more to technological side of science than to like theoretical side, if you know what I mean. I think he meant, I think Sebastjan meant something along those lines. So not knowing in advance what you're looking for, not having a clearly defined hypothesis before, let's say, observation or something, or like structuring phenomena in an experimental setting. I don't know. Does this make sense?
I think with regard to at least how I understand the history of relativity is that they started from the fact that the velocity of light is uniform and there's no absolute kind of frame of reference. And then how can you kind of translate one reference frame to the other? And the problem here is that you start with the two like presuppositions, the kind of relativity principle and the velocity of light, which are not which are thoroughly kind of theoretical. They're not even so much mathematical. Like Lorentz transformations come afterwards. It's, at least that's how I understand it, but I might be wrong. And even Einstein, I think he said that his first idea was very intuitive. It was about the kind of that the light couldn't be added to itself. The velocity of light couldn't be added to itself into infinity, which is a very theoretical, not so much mathematical point.
Yeah, and what about the pre-Socratic thinkers, for example, where there was basically no technology available to study nature, and yet they did, with pure theoretical reflection, no technology to really aid them in this process. They were just speculating, pure mind in a way.
That's true, but again,
Well,
you're kind of jumping like through millennia of things where you cannot simply ignore, the things that were happening prior to that and were technological in nature. It is only when you can establish a semi-stable system that this type of speculation can emerge. Again, this has a genealogy. It has a certain historical story. Thales didn't fall from the sky. He fell into a well, that's true, but never fell from the sky simply and just started reflecting on how everything is water. A lot of things have had to happen for him to be able to start engaging in these type of activities. And this is something I would like to point out as well. It is, again, an activity that is, I like the notion of psychotechniques. So what they were developing is a new technology that is embedded into the realm of virtuality, where you don't necessarily have to do things as you would normally did with specific interactions with the environment, but you can play around or toy around with certain models without necessarily having to embed them. But you have to have a certain structure that is presupposed, a certain techniques that allow you to basically get there. And these are many techniques such as writing, techniques such as techniques that allowed you to have a stable, let's say, urban environment and a stable way of producing foods. So again, there's a certain genealogy. And of course, if you start from a snapshot picture where you have a Thales and he's just thinking about, is everything water? Then you might say, well, there's like a reflection. But this reflection, in my opinion, again, didn't fall from the sky simply. It has to be put into a historical narrative. Even if it's a qualitative shift, it has to have a specific genealogy, so to speak.
okay, but this,
yeah, sure. Go on.
This idea of like a technology going before like theory. I mean, what we were talking about before, like the example of a theory of relativity. I don't know. I think there's a lot of confusion going on here, because on the one hand you have these sorts of theories, like a cosmological theories that try to like predict certain like phenomena that aren't really. I mean, for me, it's a interesting question. Like, would this be analogous to like to let's say human sciences or like biological sciences, where you actually are intervening with your object of study beforehand? You necessarily have to somehow change your object in order to study it. Like, you couldn't say that with respect to like the velocity of light or the cosmos in general. I mean, it would, in some respect you could, but I think it is altogether different when you're talking about people, and especially like some like objects like vital norms or stuff like that, where you actually are producing circumstances which might, I mean, you are historically, technologically producing certain circumstances within which these norms could be manifested very differently. Like, and of course, your scientific notions and practices are going to feedback in this process as well. So this is like a very different kind of science and a very different kind of technology that's involved here, in my view. So I'm not really sure. Yeah, I mean, whether the previous example was relevant or what you guys think.
I think that we should not understand technique as something self-sufficient. Rather, I think they're much more intertwined, the theory and the technique, in this way that, I mean, you can have a myriad of different techniques that in certain later epoch appear to be interrelated. But at the moment you investigate them technically, you don't really understand in what way they kind of, you can transform one technique into another, in the sense that there is a certain in what way two different technological procedures are similar. Because no two one could start from the no two things are of course identical. So the question now becomes, to what extent are two technological procedures which we employ similar? And to me, I mean, one perhaps famous example would be the Maxwell theory of magnetism, right? So you had, I forgot his name, this guy who before him he kind of described all the possible electromagnetic phenomena, but he was not able to formalize them. And then Maxwell came, and during his career he formalized them. And what he enabled is actually a different kind of employment of these techniques, even with respect to the development of relativity and quantum mechanics. But the point is that you cannot really kind of master the techniques to the fullest extent if you understand them as self-sufficient. Rather, there's this kind of almost behavioral aspect of them that determines in what way they can be used, and that is, of course, kind of proto-theory. In the same way as I don't know, the theories we were discussing before. So string theory is creating proto-techniques which are not embodied like as exact technical procedures as of now.
I would agree. I mean, I think that it's not about necessarily trying to find either try to reduce, say, theory to technology or technique, and or vice versa. It's more like trying to establish a certain dynamic relation between them. So again, to give a concrete example, you might have a certain tinkering within the crypto community, and they start developing certain models, and they have vague ideas what they would like to develop. And when the first project is launched, the other groups get into this, and they try to, and they start working on this. And when they start working on this, they try to somehow reflect on what has happened and articulate what has happened. And eventually what you get is you get a specific model that is, saying, for instance, called decentralized finance. Now you have like these decentralized finance groups and models where basically you can do, say, you can buy certain cryptos in a way that doesn't entail any mediators. So you can, the program does the whole thing. Okay, but eventually what I'm trying to say here, you get a certain notion, say the notion of DeFi, decentralized finance. And when this gets created, you get a theoretical model which makes the whole technological happening, you understand it better, it suddenly gains a specific structure, and you can modify it and employ it in more organized and better ways. So it is as if, you know, as if in a certain sense, technique strives toward theory as its pinnacle. And it is only where it attains the realm of theory that it is capable of understanding itself and seeing itself as a uniform whole. Prior to that, it's just like all over the place. So it kind of, it calls forth theoretical reflection. But this doesn't mean that theoretical reflection is a simple add-on. It's not the case that theoretical reflection would be secondary and not important. Theoretical reflection is what brings the technological endeavor to its conclusion. It is what is the fruit. And when the fruit is there, you kind of see and understand the whole process. So it is what allows you to see the overall happening again as a unified structure, as a whole. So this is the way I understand it. So they are basically, in a certain sense, of the same cloth, technique and theory. Yeah. So it's not like you have two different things, but it is one strives toward the other, which then reflects back on the other, allowing it to better understand itself and allowing it to proceed in more structured ways, which eventually open up new vistas which are unexplored. And then again, they strive towards, you know, a certain resolution.
I wouldn't say they construct a complete whole in the end. I mean, to me, it seems like they achieve a certain pinnacle of research, and then they kind of collapse because that they're so exact and so well constructed that they can perceive their own contradictions. I mean, the supposed completion of physics in the end of 19th century, for example, even the concept of gene at the turn of this century, I think those are two very important moments in which the concept itself turned out to be completely insufficient to describe the phenomena it turned out.
That's marvelous, but it was so incredibly productive for a really, really long time. Eventually, theory and theoretical models exhaust themselves. This is what Canguilhem is pointing out when he says that there is this, you have to cultivate this philosophy of intellectual adventure. You know, this is precisely, you mustn't understand technology as mere application. Technology is always an activity. In this sense, it kind of opens up new vistas, opens up new questions that are usually not embedded in a specific theory. So theories and models exhaust themselves. That's true. But once they get constituted, at least at the very beginning, they are brimming with creativity. They're brimming with something that allows a specific development, a specific idea, a specific tradition to really run its course until it runs out of gas, so to speak. So yes, for sure, it's not like, you know, they strive towards a certain pinnacle, but this is not the end all, be all. It's something that is just a temporary solution of sorts. It is a node in a broader temporal network, but it is a node that provides for a temporary rest, temporary structure that then kind of eventually opens up new questions surrounding it and falls apart, basically. Or not necessarily falls apart, but it gets integrated eventually into a broader or larger structure in a certain sense, in which it requires a new meaning. So it is a part of it, but it has a very different meaning in it.
I mean, I will still question whether technology is such a part of every kind of theory, because I think that's this specific characteristic of humans that I think we can divorce our theory from the technology. Sure, like in the beginning, genealogically speaking, like in evolution, perhaps our cognitive, speculative, theoretical capacities developed because of this close relationship of thinking with technology. But if you look at the history of philosophy, much of it seems very much divorced from any kind of technology. Like it's just pure theory. So yeah, I don't know.
No, I would buy that. I buy that. I think that eventually what happens is you get a new types of psychotechnology that develop and then basically go their separate ways. But then there's a different story. I'm not going to defend this too strongly.
I mean, I feel like this discussion in a way can be summarized by the relationship between Plato and Aristotle. Like Plato was pointing up, it's the ideas which sort of influence the matter, and shape it. And whereas Aristotle was returning back to the ground, to the technology, to the matter. And I think this is the same tension going on in this discussion, whether it's technology first or theory first.
But just as a side note, I wouldn't say that Aristotle's science or physics was technology based. He had this clear idea of how physical world is structured, and then he used this to explain physical phenomena. So I think that's like a false dichotomy between Plato and Aristotle in this concrete sense.
Sorry, can you repeat that? I'm not sure I understood the point about Aristotle.
Yeah, you said that Aristotle, like, his point was that pointing to the ground and saying we should examine empirical phenomena and then construct theories out of it. Well, his physics was all about having this idea of, I don't know, helomorphism or four causes, and then trying to explain phenomena a posterior to these ideas. So it wasn't like he was looking at the world and saying, oh, this could be explained in this way, but he has had these ideas about how the physical world is structured and then explained things with it.
Yeah,
That's just like a footnote to
but then if we look at his biology, for example, he was very much an empiricist. Like he was just chronicling all the different species and describing them, sometimes very inaccurately. So maybe but his physics.
But he also wrote the first, I don't know how many books of physics are just theory about how different levels of phenomena and how physical world is structured, and then he actually used those terms to explain all his empirical research. So I guess but yeah, more than Plato, he actually did empirical research, but I wouldn't say he was very he favored some kind of tinkering with the empirical world and seeing what happens approach to exploring. But yeah, that's not really relevant, sorry.
Yeah, I think there's an important experimental dimension of technique, right? As I understand Aristotle's biology, for example, it's mostly descriptive. There's no so much, I mean, when you get to Darwin, there's really important example of kind of experimenting with breeding, which kind of, it's a cornerstone of his theory. There's this whole embryonic developmental tradition which experiments with what happens to the embryo when you do different stuff to it. And this experiment itself, I mean, people did not understand breeding and then started to breed animals. It was kind of one with the other. Actually, I was just reading once more the introduction that Foucault wrote to this book, and there's this really nice, interesting quote that Canguilhem insists that an idea becomes a biological concept at the moment the reductive effects which are tied to an external analogy become obliterated for the benefit of a specific analysis of the living being. So that kind of there's this rupture where the concept is no longer understood as a mere analogy, but as something internal to the living process with which you can then experiment. Because if you use just its analogous, you cannot really induce a certain difference in which that's analysis. I mean, the analysis functions. So that yeah, sorry.
Nea, did you want to say something before? It seemed like, oh, okay. I have the impression that you were raising your hand.
I have a question. I don't understand the role of language. It seems to me that language is something that I would consider theory, so that it has sort of theoretical presuppositions that then impose themselves when we want to study reality empirically. But that's on one hand, but on the other hand, we could also understand it as technology. I think that Sebastjan before mentioned that writing and so on forms a part of technology. So in this sense, if language is technology, it's obvious that all the problems are defined by technology in some sense. So theory is then, as we've described it previously, but I'm not really sure why. What's the difference between theory and technology? It seems to me that when they come together, it's really within our minds, not within, I don't know, society or different groups of people or different philosophers. Ones are theoretical and physicists that could be more empirical and so on. I'm not sure.
That's a good point. But yeah, I think that the role of language here is really important, because it has this double momentum, or double nature, one might say. On the one hand, it is something that is very much embodied, and it's very much related to activity. So, and it requires a specific technique. There's a really nice book by Abram. It's called The Spell of Sensuous. It's a really nice book. Again, yet another nice book, where he kind of goes into this. He's a phenomenologist of sorts, and he's very much a well-known name in the field of eco-philosophy. But the point in this book that I really liked, and again, I forgot most of it, is where he basically tries to show the impact of the development of writing has on the experience of the world, how this seemingly innocuous technology kind of provided a really strong shift and a strong move in how you perceive and relate to the environment and you think about it. And also how different types of writings are kind of, that in different types of writings, there are specific preferences to specific modes and ways of relating to the world. So what I'm trying to say is that when you master a certain technique, such as language, it becomes transparent. This is interesting. It becomes transparent. Once you master a language, you read a book, you don't really see the letters in a certain sense. You see them, but you don't see them in the sense that they would be the foci of what you're seeing. You're seeing the meaning. And the meaning is embedded not in the individual either letter or word, but it is related more to the sentence and even broader than that. It kind of stretches even out of the book itself. So you don't see the object that you're looking at, you don't see the signatures that are on it, but you kind of penetrate and get to the meaning. And I think that this is what these techniques allow you to do. They kind of allow you to develop certain patterns that are in specific ways. There are bodily patterns, but if you understand body from a broader perspective, like Merleau-Pontian perspective, that can get stabilized. And then what happens is that you can shift around and move in the virtual domains that allow you to then, go in different ways and construct different things and open up different questions and address certain things differently. So you start from something that is very material, if you like, and something that is very active, but it opens up these layers of meaning and significance that after a while seem like they're almost disembodied and they are completely relegated to your mind. And I still, there's a really nice, there are really nice reflections on this in the last third of Phenomenology of Perception, the part that most people never read, where Merleau-Ponty basically talks about this famous cogito example in Descartes, where he's like, well, I'm going to now, just discard everything and not think about everything and just, what happens. But he says he's writing this in a book. He's writing this in a book. He's using a language to do these things. So you enter into this world, intersubjective world, that is strongly permeated with these sedimented meanings that are in a very strong way related to these technologies of writing and speaking and intersubject communication, and they become transparent. But as soon as something goes wrong, you kind of become aware of them. So if something goes wrong, you become aware of them. They are there. It's not like they disappear completely. So he's trying to say it's one thing to play a game in this and pretend that you're a disembodied spirit, and then you move and you get to the cogito or whatnot. But it's a half-baked truth, I think Merleau-Ponty would say. You're kind of overlooking certain important things. So I don't know if that makes any sense. I have to pick something up. So you can continue now with this if you find it.
I think yeah, I think that Derrida makes a good point. The main point of Derrida is that you cannot really have a transparent technique. So he says that one can think about language, that there's kind of the spirit of language, which we understand as meaning behind the words. But the problem is that the history of language kind of disturbs this meaning from the inside. So the meanings of the words change, the pronunciations of the words change based on what is written. And he gives a number of examples, especially to Rousseau, I think, that you cannot really differentiate so good between what is written and what is said or what is understood, because one and the other are always in a kind of becoming relation. I think this is very important for our discussion here for the technique, because I wouldn't say that the theory that we develop or that a scientist develop is completely transparent to him. Like it seems that one could understand our discussion as there are two different poles. So there's technique, which is not transparent at all, and it just happens. And there's this theory which is completely transparent, and you can understand it and you can play with it. But the problem is that this theory can get disembodied from the technique. But I would say that it's much more the relationship between these two poles is much more complicated, because it's not just that you do something with technique and you do something with theory, and you do something with technique and something with theory. But when you think about theory in a different way, the technique itself gets restructured. So the way you interact with technique gets structured. In the same way, if you restructure the processes that are used in technical dealings with the world, you understand things in a different way, so that you cannot have just kind of the sedimentation and transparency of the technique, if anyone understands what I'm saying.
Yeah, personally, I really agree with that. I feel like there's almost like a trend of trying to reestablish the primacy of technique as opposed to theory. But I don't see why should we prioritize either of these two? Are they really possible without each other? And one differentiation, which I think I've mentioned in previous times, is I think we should differentiate between technique and technology. I think most animals actually possess various techniques, but I think this is the unique thing, I suppose, one of the many unique things about humans, is that we marry technique with theory, and thus we make technology. We actually we are constantly trying to make sense of our techniques, and I think that basically constantly changes these techniques at the same time as these techniques are shaping our logos or sense of them.
To me, the really important part here is that there's kind of lack of a foundation, so that you cannot say that first there came technique and then then the theory got introduced, but that you cannot really logical or like a priori there's a certain impossibility of developing a history of theory or a history of technique separately, which is actually kind of implicitly present in every history of science almost, that you cannot really understand what they were doing if you don't understand the technique, and the other way around actually. So yeah.
How would you guys define technique, if anybody cares to try? Because it's not at all obvious to me how we are using this term right now, and also in a broader this philosophical context.
Let me find an etymological dictionary quickly.
Something that
because okay, so let me give a starting point. Maybe what I'm interested in, like you could say, okay, technique is something external to your epistemic concerns, or at least something like yeah, forming a background of it, or like is it just like a method of producing something, or does it include like your practical needs? So you could say like it's a method of producing something external to what you want and what you are interested in, or does it include what you want? So is it technique itself a kind of desire of a subject, or is it just a method external to it? Because this is the two poles I think we're shifting here, because if you're saying like the relationship between technique and theory, what I'm thinking about is like the relationship between like praxis and theory or something like, or is this not what you guys meant?
I mean, I would personally say that technique is the method. It's the way we make things happen according to what we're trying to make happen. Whereas technology is this more, is technique made sense of, intellectualized, and so forth. I don't say desire is necessarily a part of technique. I don't know.
Okay, because what Sebastjan was talking about before, I think we included desire in this, at least in the sense of a kind of an epistemic desire, in the sense that you don't really know what you're looking for until you find it, with regards to crypto guys, or any kind of like in the sense that your own kind of interest is shaped by the process of inquiry. You don't start with a clearly defined question, something like that. Even a clearly defined interest or a desire or a interest in this practical sense.
I can give you like a concrete example here. I have a friend. We were, in a certain sense, we were going to the same high school together. He was a rather brilliant mathematician and physicist, one of these geeky guys, and we kind of went our own separate ways. He studied computer science, and at a certain point he was lucky or smart enough, it's sometimes hard to say, to invest 9,000 euros in Ethereum, which is the second largest cryptocurrency. At the very moment it hit the market, when it was, I don't know, it cost below 1 cent, I think. And now it's approximately 1,500 euros. So he became a millionaire basically overnight. And after a while, we kind of got back together. We started talking again about technology, and he also introduced me to the blockchain technology and crypto markets and cryptocurrencies. And for me, the entry into this world was extremely frustrating. This is a very dynamic, very hectic, and a very messy world. And I was trying to make sense of some of the projects that I was studying. So there are several interesting projects out there, and I was kind of trying to get what they're doing and how they're doing it. So I was trying to like really read up on these technologies and trying to understand how they operate. And then I would have these debates with a friend of mine who knew way more than I had. But the thing is, I soon realized that he doesn't really know many things either. He just kind of has a vague sense of what this does, and he incorporates this into a broader network. And he said, just, you know, don't worry too much about it, you know, just move on. You know, it's just like, try to get a glimpse of it and then move on. And the thing is, eventually you start getting it. You kind of see things, you don't really understand it fully, but it's something, it's difficult to describe, but it was, in a certain sense, for me personally, it was extremely liberating. It's hard to describe this feeling, but for me, it was very liberating, because I actually got way more comfortable also in developing some of my own ideas without necessarily completely understanding what I'm doing. It's just, I started tinkering more, and things became clearer as I was doing the tinkering. And he kind of, he was one of the people, or one of the contributing factors that allowed me, in a certain sense, to do this. So the way they approach things there, I'm not saying that this is the right way to do, and he really appreciated when we would have debates, my ongoing reflections on what's happening. So for example, we would go on a walk, right? And he would describe a project to me, and he would be like, almost as some sort of a prophet. He would just utter sentences and they would just flow out there, and I was constantly kind of, whoa. And then I was trying to do a reflection on where we're at and what's happening. And he said that he himself, by this exchange, profited a lot, because some of the things became clearer for him when he was saying them, and I was repeating them in a way that when I was trying to make sense of what he said for myself. So by making sense of what he said to myself, he started understanding certain things in a better way. So it was this messy dialogical setting that wasn't really, he was saying something. Apparently he was the knower without really knowing many of the stuff, and saying stuff to somebody who didn't know and who was trying to understand what he was saying, and then uttering the same things out in the open, and the knower got to know things better that way. So it's a concrete example of what I'm trying to get at here. It's this strange tinkering and just going at it and exploring, and eventually things kind of sediment and start gaining some sort of shape. And it's a strange experience, because you don't really know who was it that brought about this. So it's a very decentralized process in a certain sense. The meaning kind of starts unfolding itself, and nobody's truly the possessor of the meaning. It's, I don't know, it's difficult to describe, but maybe this is a very concrete example to kind of get this more down to earth.
I didn't understand it. I mean, I understand the example, but I'm sorry. Is this an example of the relationship between what could be theory or technique, or
Yeah. What I was trying to point out is this this messy relationship with technique and theory. So usually people, it's people in the community somehow are trying to develop something. Okay, maybe I'll try this from a different perspective. So the whole crypto scene happened as a reaction to what happened in the financial markets in 2008. So somebody tried to develop a financial system that would not really be impacted by these selfish interests of certain institutions. So Bitcoin was developed with that aim, and the person who developed it had a fairly organized and well thought out idea of what he was trying to develop, but he had absolutely no idea what this will open up. So he started kind of developing something. He had an idea what he would like to achieve, and he started developing it, and he kind of laid down something. But then this started to take life of its own, and it just opened up new avenues and new possibilities, and these called forth for further reflections, and people started reflecting on these, and then kind of created these temporary stable models of what's happening, but this was just, constantly an ongoing thing. So it's this ongoing dialectic, I think, between doing something and then reflecting on it, and then this reflection kind of creating a semi-stable something, and this semi-stable something is surrounded by unexplored things and tensions, and these eventually open up new avenues, and these need to be reflected upon. So it's a very dynamic process. This is what I'm trying to point out, and that the technique is not just a tool in the sense of, here you are a theorist and then you just employ a certain method or a strategy. It is something that is not even a method often. It becomes a method through doing it. So you start doing something, it's messy as hell. Eventually it starts becoming more clear and you start developing models, and then you also develop methodologies and strategies somehow, and this is something that I was trying to kind of depict with these exchanges. Did this make sense, or was it just messy again?
Makes sense, but I don't know if maybe somebody else had this idea, that I can see this as a shift of a broader structure of knowledge, maybe like Foucault's episteme. So this, what you're describing, is could be an individual perspective of something that was bound to happen. Do you know what I mean?
No, I don't think I know.
For example, maybe, I don't know, the whole structure of knowledge and the world was set in this way that this revolution was bound to happen. And for example, I assume that revolution in computational social science will happen, and nobody knows how or who will be doing the messy stuff you've just described. But for sure, it's bound to happen. So in a way, it's an individual description of what people do when they don't know what they're doing, but nevertheless, it's obvious that, or perhaps maybe that's just a retrospective view, that when you look at it, from when you reflect on it, it seems like it was bound to happen, and it was not a coincidence, although from individual perspective, it seems like a messy thing. Yeah, I don't know.
I think that to a certain degree, it is a retroactive illusion, but there's a certain point to what you're saying. I think that once you establish certain conditions, so to speak, so when you start tinkering with something and you establish, say, a certain product and certain reflections start appearing, yeah? So you have this technology that leans toward a certain apex in a theoretical model. Once this model is constructed, I would say that something similar is at work as in this famous figure ground example in Gestalt and Merleau-Ponty. So what happens is the model culminates in a specific figure. So this is the structure, this is the clear part. Now you understand, you have a technology seen as a whole, but it becomes surrounded by a certain background. And you can move from that specific figure only to specific restructurations of the field. So on the horizon, you have certain possibilities that are given to you. So it's not completely at random. You cannot move from there to just anything. It is surrounded by a halo of possibilities, but it's not like it's predetermined in the sense of that you only have one possibility. There is an array of possibilities, but once one gets constituted, it seems as if this was destined to happen. But it's not necessarily completely destined. It's not predetermined as if A necessitates B. A necessitates a certain interval of possibilities. But once one is constituted, it seems like this was the one that was kind of predetermined. This is how I kind of see it. Any further reflections on this? And yeah, this is your field.
I don't know why you think it's my field. I
Technology?
Yeah, I mean, yes, technology, but I'm not that interested in that kind of way. If I have to give my opinion, I would say that it would be fair to look at technology as something autonomous, just as we look at, as in my opinion, we should look at science. That's why I like Vienna Circle and all that. But otherwise, I don't have enough knowledge to comment anything valuable here. So maybe next time.
But the thing is, the reason why I kind of was interested in hearing your perspective is because what Canguilhem is pushing forward here is in many ways opposed to what I think, if I understand you correctly, at this point, what you find appealing in some of the authors and approaches. Because there you have this, I don't know if I understand this correctly, but there's an attempt to rehabilitate rationality of sorts. But here it's the picture is way more messy. It's less Vienna Circle than one would want.
Yeah. I mean, when I'm reading him, I mostly don't agree on intuitive level, but then again, I never read anything like that, so I'm giving him a chance to maybe change my mind. But at the moment he didn't. I even before, when we were talking about pain and reaching this deeper levels of understanding ourselves and the world via pain, I wasn't convinced, because then everyone would have this deeper understanding of the world and wouldn't want to cause, I don't know, violence or something like that, because I mean, we all experience some sort of pain. And also this kind of, I mean, I like this messy part of science and all of that, but I also feel like that this kind of thinking is very, how to say, it's very common in, those kind of health circles that are very popular, this kind of longevity circles, do sports. But I mean, I think it's not a coincidence that those kind of circles that are very popular on Instagram and whatnot are so in bed with spirituality, because it kind of, even though they are doing like scientific stuff right now, doing exercise, eating that kind of food, whatever, now it's doing something to their body, they are then introducing spirituality into the same team, like it's connected. And I think, I don't know. I have similar feelings with this kind of authors that we are reading here. I mean, I'm not saying that he is like a shaman or something, but saying that something is messy doesn't necessarily tell us anything. That's my point. Our job is to make things clearer, not messier. Yeah.
But it's a problem. It's a problem if you forget. It's not the clarity is not the problem. I would assume that most people would agree that this is indeed something that one should strive towards. The problem is if you forget that this clarity is embedded in certain horizons or circles of indetermination, ambiguity, and that these are somehow not necessarily only perhaps necessary or ineradicable, but they are actually also constitutive of clarity, just as clarity can be constituted of this messiness. This is where I think things become interesting.
Yes, me too. But yeah, I don't have enough knowledge. I just have this feeling that we do know why are we using certain tools. I don't think that we are forgetting that easily. I mean, if we have to question the nature of our language and all of that, okay, that's different things. But when you're doing something, usually, and scientists and whatnot, they usually know why you're using certain tools, and these tools are a product of, I don't know, long history or maybe not. And I think it's just making things more complicated, maybe on the topics that doesn't need that. I don't need that. I don't know, sorry.
I think there's an important point here, a difference in the sense that one could understand that the relationship between technique and theory in such a way that you develop technique, and when this technique is developed enough, you can use certain concepts to think about it, or rather in the other way around. So you develop the theoretical aspect, and when it is sufficiently developed, when it has a certain well-developed meaning, you can apply it to natural phenomena and then construct techniques out of this. But what I think Sebastjan was trying to say is that it's not necessary to develop either of these things completely. Rather, you can, or this is my interpretation, sorry if I understand you incorrectly, but what I find fascinating is most of the time scientists think about incomplete meanings, right? So, I mean, in Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, you have this idea that first a meaning is constituted and then you can think about it. The point here would be a Derridean point, that the moment you kind of institute not a certain meaning, but rather a way of enacting this meaning, which does not need to be complete, you can already think about it, or rather it is necessary to think about it for it to remain intelligible in a way. So that's the theory and technique.
Isaac.
Sorry?
Give an example.
Yeah, what you were saying is that so there's this kind of circularity between what people were doing and what people were thinking about what people were doing. But the problem is that what people were doing was not constituted as a complete phenomena. Like nobody couldn't really saw what was happening. And so the problem now is, of course, I have a phenomena and I want to think about it, but I can't really see it clearly. So I think about it, and by thinking about it, I constitute it better. And it starts to kind of starts to contain a certain sedimented meaning, contained whole. But this whole would not have appeared if I hadn't thought about it, if it didn't have a certain possibility within it to be thought about. So that those are not really, I mean, the important thing is that you can think about stuff even if they're not completely clear. That's what I want to say.
But you would agree that you would change it in a certain sense.
Change what?
Yeah, change the phenomenon by thinking about it. If you merely enact it and then you start thinking about it, it changes.
I mean, I would say that it's not possible to just enact it. There's always this kind of proto theory in the back of your head, which, yeah, that's the point. It's just what comes in front.
When you articulate it, does it get changed?
It changes the way one interacts with it. So
it
in
changes.
A sense, yeah, in a sense it does, yeah, but it does not need to change all of a sudden. There's not a Gestalt switch. Like, I understand it differently. No, I see a different avenue along which I could walk, and then by pursuing that direction, the things start to appear differently because I interact with them differently, and they, of course, then open up a new way of thinking also about it, but it's not kind of one process and the other. There's not a Gestalt switch from the other. It's just kind of messy process of mixing.
The Bolognese spaghetti? That's an internal joke, by the way. Yeah, any other comments before we say goodbye. This is today's topics were really interesting for me. So this is something I've been also very much interested in. So if anybody has anything else.
I mean, it's something I just say. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
It's a short thought, but I find it quite problematic to put this problem in terms of clearness and unclearness. Like, I don't know where you guys see clarity in science and where this deviates from that standard. I'm not really sure, because
Awesome.
I mean, when I read Canguilhem, it seems much clearer than maybe some of the contemporary biology, neuroscience stuff that I engage with. So I'm not really sure.
That's a good point, actually.
I mean, he's much more systematic, at least, like much more. He puts, he has like a, maybe I'm reading a little bit of a system into him. So yeah, I won't go into it. Yeah, I think I think he is more systematic than many contemporary authors that engage in similar questions.
Yeah, that's true. So I don't really know what to add here, because I would actually buy this. And I think Enea would too. It's more about, I think that there's a tendency, for example, in authors such as Merleau-Ponty and Canguilhem and even Derrida, to kind of open up this space to a meaning that is not necessarily understood in a way that has been developed in, say, modern philosophy, early modern philosophy. So this ideal of having a clear, determinate idea, and that this somehow becomes a foundational stone of either your epistemology or your metaphysics. So they kind of have this impression that it is necessary to open up ways of thinking and domains where you have an ambiguous meaning or indeterminate meaning or a dynamic meaning. So something that is temporal in nature, something that unfolds. And because it unfolds, it is not really completely exhaustively captured or capturable. But from what I understand, Enea would somehow want to rehabilitate this clarity that has become obfuscated. And I think this is a good point. But so the motivation is correct, but it leads to an error. That would be my idea. What do I mean by that? I think that the overall reaction to what has happened in, say, certain strata of French philosophy has become so excessive in its obscurity that it was bound to cause a reaction, because people kind of start having this impression that this was just, it went too far, and it simply, it was a complete devaluation of reason and of articulate, clear language or clarity in general. But I think that it's simply impossible to rehabilitate clarity in the same way as it was propounded in the past. You cannot make the, say, realist turn again. I mean, it can be done, but somehow you're just cashing in on the fact that a certain tradition has become out of wind, that is becoming exhausted. And I fear that if this is done without taking on board some of the valuable stuff from that tradition, then what will happen is in 50 or 100 years, you will have another backlash. And people will rediscover some of the things that were valuable. And there are many valuable things. This is the important part. If you read Canguilhem, if you read Merleau-Ponty, there's tons of valuable stuff in there. And taking this on board and integrating it into your thought, I think that this is almost a necessary step. And some of the things are happening too quickly. There is a very strong and visceral reaction to some of the things that have happened. But I think that it's moving in the wrong direction precisely because of what's kind of happening. But I don't know enough to be really confident in what I'm saying now. Maybe Timothy knows more about this, or even Enea.
I mean, I wouldn't equate this, like, let's say, neo-rationalistic tendency toward clarity with realism. I mean, the situation is pretty complicated on that front, I guess. But yeah, I would totally agree. Like that, the backlash, like with, let's say, Quentin Lesu, was really naive. In my book, was a kind of naive move that facilitated a whole movement that was destined to fail because of like, I wouldn't say of a too radical a step move towards realism, but at least a not well thought through answer to like the constructivist anti-realism of the 60s. Like, it wasn't. Also, I would very much agree with you, Sebastjan, that much more productive view would be some kind of more serious engagement, at least with the with anti-rationalism.
I think so
anti-realism of
yes, I think so too, and I think that this backlash has some merit, that it's useful. It was also called for. You know, it's just that people really got fed up with what's been going on, and you cannot go on endlessly with this. I mean, you can, you know, if you have a steady position and you have a nice paycheck and you write these obscure little papers or books or what have you. I mean, you can, of course you can, but on the other hand, you know, the new generations will come and eventually it's just, they're not gonna buy that. So yeah, I think that this exchange or this dialogue would be very interesting, like a more serious engagement with what was of value here. And what people tend to forget is that what you react against is usually not a monolithic tradition. So, for example, when people talk about correlationism, like Melosu, when he talks about it, it's one of those notions where, you know, you kind of throw it out there, but then you look at different authors and you see that there has been a whole plethora of approaches and attitudes towards this, and different takes and stances. So, yeah, maybe this is a bit dull to most, but yeah. This is actually the very avant-garde in contemporary philosophy. So the razor edge, the most boring stuff. Everybody started yawning. Primož, you wanted to add something, maybe? As a
I'll save it. I'll save it for next time. I think we're tired.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Any final thoughts by anyone? Wow. What a vocal group. Okay, then let's call it a day, maybe. This was a nice discussion. And yeah, next time the topic is a continuation of what we've been talking about today in many regards. So this is where Canguilhem actually goes into the idea of normativity and what it somehow means and why he thinks is important. So have a nice day and a lovely weekend.